Welcome to Chapter 9 of our Civil War unit, The War Begins. Secession and Nullification. In 1860, after President Lincoln was elected, 7 slave states seceded from the Union. These states justified this action on an idea called nullification. The idea of nullification originally came from John C. Calhoun when he was Andrew Jackson's vice president. He argued that since the states had agreed on the Constitution together and formed a contract, they could keep the federal government in check and cancel any laws they disagreed with. Southerners took this a step further, saying that since the government was threatening slavery, an institution that was technically protected by the Constitution, they could instead break off from the contract and form their own country. The Confederate States of America. On February 4, 1861, representatives from the 7 seceding states met in Montgomery, Alabama to write a new constitution. 3 days later, they announced the creation of the Confederate States of America. Their new constitution protected slavery and guaranteed that it would survive for a long time. Then these representatives chose a new president, Jefferson Davis. Davis was a cotton planter from Mississippi who owned slaves. He had fought in the Mexican-American War and was a member of the U.S. Senate. Lincoln's first inaugural. On March 4, 1861, President Lincoln was sworn in as the new President of the United States. Leading into his presidency, 7 of the 15 slave states had left the Union, and 4 more threatened to leave if Lincoln took any military action. Lincoln made an appeal to the slave states, saying that the war was not necessary, and neither was secession. Lincoln said that he did not intend on using military force against the South, and he was not going to interfere with slavery in the South either. Fort Sumter. After the first 7 states seceded, they immediately began seizing federal buildings throughout the South, including post offices, arsenals, and forts. Once Lincoln was sworn in, only 2 southern forts remained in the federal government's control. One of these forts was Fort Sumter, a small installment off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. This did not bode well for the Union, since South Carolina had been the home of John C. Calhoun and was the first state to secede. Like Massachusetts during the Revolutionary War, South Carolina was the most passionate state for the Confederacy, and it demanded control of the fort. Shots. The commanding officer, Major Robert Anderson, refused to give up his fort, but his men were quickly running out of supplies. In order to get food to the men without provoking war, President Lincoln informed South Carolina that he would be sending unarmed boats to restock the fort, promising not to send more men or weapons. Jefferson Davis disliked this idea, concerned that this would allow Anderson's men to keep the fort. The fort's surrender was once again demanded by South Carolina, and when they didn't comply, the fort was fired upon by Confederate cannons for 30 hours. The effects. After surviving the 30 hours of cannon fire, Anderson and his men finally surrendered. The first shots of the war were fired, and the Confederacy was to blame. While the Union had tried to avoid war by compromising to maintain peace, the South had attacked first, seemingly unprovoked. The only fort in the South still in Union hands was Fort Pickens off the southern coast of Florida in Key West. What would become one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history had begun, and it would last 5 horrific years. Northern response. Northerners were appalled by the firing on Fort Sumter. They believed that the South was engaged in a rebellion against both the Union and the Constitution itself. In response, President Lincoln called for conscription, also known as the draft, requiring all able-bodied young men to register for military service. President Lincoln also suspended something called habeas corpus, a power granted in the Constitution, giving him more military authority as president and allowing him to imprison anyone who he thought posed a threat to the North. Southern response. The South believed that South Carolina had acted justly. They celebrated their actions, saying these were the first steps in their struggle for independence. Because Lincoln was responding with a call to arms, other slave states began to join the Confederacy. These states included Virginia. West Virginia would later secede from Virginia and join back with the Union. North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee. 11 of the 30 states were now in rebellion against the Union. Summary. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter when the South refused to let the Northern troops resupply. 4 more states followed them, and a total of 11 states were now in rebellion against the Union, and the war had begun. Please make sure to have all of your terms and your summary filled out in your packet.